Good morning. Welcome, everybody. It's a pleasure today to have our first keynote. Professor Lucio Baccaro will talk about growth models in Europe. Growth models in Europe. Which future? Mr. Baccaro, it's a great pleasure to have you here. Since late 2017, he's director at Max Planck Institute for the Studies of Societies in Cologne. Before, he was full professor of macrosociology at the Department of Sociology at the Geneva School of Social Sciences. In his earlier career, he held a number of positions and had a number of research stays in Italy, Austria, and the MIT. In the US, where he also finished his PhD earlier in Cambridge. Mr. Baccaro also had a professional career outside the university. I think he was in the mid-2000s, he was at Geneva at the International Labour Organization, a researcher and later head of a research unit at the International Institute for Labour Studies. So he's fluent in a number of languages, I guess, in Italian, English, German, and his research focuses mainly on comparative political economy and comparative employment relations, and more generally on economic sociology and political sociology. He has published in a number of journals, such as Socioeconomic Review, British Journal of Industrial Relations and Comparative Sociology, and his most recent book was published with Cambridge University, Trajectories of Neoliberal Transformation, European Industrial Relations since the 1970s. He has been also lead researcher of a number of research projects, more recently a research project conducted together with Jonas Pontusson on Fordist growth models in European political economies. At Max Planck Institute for the Studies of Societies, he's the head of the research group on the political economy of growth models. And I think it's a very interesting approach, bringing in a new direction in comparative political economy with his growth model perspective, focusing particularly on underlying social coalitions of national varieties of capitalism. Thus, he's identifying different models, growth models, across countries. And today he will present his findings and his ideas on Europe. Of course, the issue of growth is also very important for our research group here in Jena, which was mainly looking at growth and post-growth societies. So we are very happy and we're delighted to have you here, and you're the guest.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming on early morning, and thank you for the kind introduction. So I will give you an overview of the research program that I am running in Cologne, and in the end, but only in the end, I will address the question of which futures for growth in Europe. It's mostly going to be the past and the present, I'm afraid. So first of all, what is this growth model perspective? It's a new perspective on comparative capitalism. I mean, both comparative political economy, I would say also generally speaking, macro-sociology has focused heavily on cross-country differences based on supply-side peculiarities. So the emphasis is on differences, and the way countries differ is because they have different institutions, what Jonas Pontusson and I call supply-side institutions. The clearest example is the varieties of capitalism framework, where there are essentially two production regimes, and they are undergirded by different institutional sets. The institutional set of coordinated market economies, Germany being the quintessential coordinated market economy, and the institutional set of liberal market economy. But a similar situation can also be found in the literature on comparative welfare states. again, the emphasis is on institutions that affect firm performance or affect the supply side, for example, human capital development. Here there is a fairly drastic, but also very simple shift. So countries differ, but they differ primarily in the way they grow or fail to grow. And there are different drivers of growth. So there are different demand drivers of growth, typically domestic demand-driven economies versus foreign demand-driven economies. And we will see that within domestic demand-driven, the most important contributor is household consumption. Why the focus on growth? And here I am borrowing a page from my colleagues at the Max Planck Institute in Cologne. For a capitalist society, growth is of fundamental importance for reproduction. Capitalism depends on the ability to validate expectations of growing material prosperity. That's why the focus on growth, as opposed to traditionally the profit rate, the accumulation rate, and so on and so forth. And the other key idea of the growth model perspective is that behind different demand drivers of growth, there are different key sectors. And these key sectors have requirements that are one way or another incorporated into public policy. And sectors are key both for their contribution to aggregate demand and for their contribution to the ability that countries have or don't have to innovate, and hence for their contribution to productivity increase. Now, if you are interested in growth and how countries differ with respect to growth, you have to take macroeconomics seriously. We as social scientists can no longer afford to take the position that we have taken in the past. Macroeconomics is a specialized policy field. We leave it to the specialists, the macroeconomists, and especially the mainstream macroeconomists. That position is no longer a tenable one. So macroeconomics is taken seriously by the growth model perspective, but not the kind of macroeconomics that students learn in top departments, the so-called modern macro, including new Keynesian macroeconomics. Modern macro has very little to say about the politics of growth. Growth is essentially a supply-side phenomenon for the neoclassical growth rate. It depends on democracy, on demography, on the saving rate, and even the so-called endogenous growth theory has very little to say about the politics of growth. In a nutshell, and with the exception of very recent post-crisis development in mainstream macroeconomics, for mainstream macro, growth is essentially a supply-side phenomenon, and aggregate demand does not matter except for the short run. What we argue is that in order to understand the politics of growth, we have to go back a few decades in time, and especially we have to go back to four key authors: Keynes, Cholesky, Minsky, and Kaldor. From Keynes, we take the idea that demand determines output and employment in the short run, but also in the long run. So there's no Say's law. It's not the case the supply determines its own demand. It's the opposite to a certain extent. Demand determines supply. From Cholesky, the idea that distribution is of fundamental importance for growth. Especially a distribution that systematically penalizes labor income is likely to create a leakage in growth because there's going to be a leakage in aggregate demand. From Minsky, the idea that financialized capitalism, unregulated capitalism, is inherently unstable. And part of the reason why it's inherently unstable is the notion that there is no such thing as an exogenous money supply. Money is endogenous, and the demand for money is partly dependent on demand itself. Banks create money. And finally, from Kaldor, the idea that productivity, the supply side, depends on demand and on labor market rigidities. On demand, this is the famous Kaldor-Verdorn law. If demand expands, productivity will also expand because of economies of scale, and labor market rigidities, this is actually the opposite of the received wisdom. If wages are high in relative terms, if there are institutional rigidities, there are going to be incentives for capital-labor substitution, i.e. firms will increase the increase investment in the relatively cheaper factor, which becomes capital. Now, at the cost of a great simplification, let me give you an idea of what the pre-globalization period looked like with regard to growth. This is the so-called wage-led growth model, also known in the regulation school theory as Fordist growth model, and it is a cycle, something that can be thought of as a virtuous cycle. Let's start with productivity increases, right at the bottom. So the economy generates efficiencies. These productivity increases are intermediated by collective bargaining. Collective bargaining indexes real wages to productivity increases. They feed wage increases. Wage increases feed demand, both through consumption and through investments. If the market broadens, there are incentives to invest, and the expansion of demand, as well as new investment, increase productivity. It's a cycle. It's a cycle which is institutionally mediated. The key institution is collective bargaining. Now, there are, of course, cross-national differences. So this is an oversimplification. But what I'm interested in is the following. This model no longer exists. This model no longer exists for both endogenous and exogenous reasons. The endogenous reason is inflation. The key assumption of Cholesky macroeconomics is that when firms are faced with an increase in demand, they will expand production, i.e. they will increase capacity utilization rather than responding by increasing prices. That's the key assumption. So demand increases, they increase capacity. However, they're targeting a normal level of capacity. They see that they are on the upper level of capacity utilization. They reconstitute the normal level by investing. Well, unfortunately, reality showed that at least in part, firms responded to demand increases by inflation. Inflation was the key problem of the wage-led growth model. And the second problem had to do with trade and especially financial liberalization. Trade liberalization made wage moderation, which is detrimental to growth in the Cholesky growth model. If there is wage moderation, demand will not expand, and so the circle will stop. But with trade liberalization, export-oriented firms can actually grow by moderating wages. And capital liberalization makes it impossible to do what goes under the name of financial repression. You can no longer undercut at the national level the rate of return on capital, which is applicable internationally. The response to the inflation problem, again, this is a very cursory overview, was across all industrialized countries, labor market liberalization, including a more or less open attack on trade unions and collective bargaining. And that had a very important consequence, because this institutional mediator here, collective bargaining, was undermined. And so now you had to move directly from productivity increases into wage increases without going through collective bargaining. The neoclassical growth model says that that always takes place, but that happens in the model because the assumption is that these are perfectly competitive markets. In reality, in the absence of the institutional mediator, productivity increases no longer went into wage increases. They went into profits. And the manifestation of that was a generalized increase in the capital shares of GDP and a decline in the wage share. What does it mean that the capital share of GDP increases? It means that income, rather than being used to purchase goods and services, it's being used to purchase financial assets. This is the beginning of the financialization cycle. So, what happens with the crisis of wage led? Advanced countries have a common problem. With capital shares increasing everywhere, there is a potential problem of deficient demand. There are excess savings. This common problem is addressed in different ways. On the one hand, you can continue to stimulate consumption. So consumption remains the key driver of growth, but rather than stimulating it through real wages, which are essentially flat or certainly no longer in line with productivity, you stimulate it by facilitating the access to debt. As we will see, consumption-led economies still have real wage increases which are higher than in other growth models. But real wages, rather than being exogenous, they become endogenous. They depend on favorable labor market conditions, especially in the service sectors. So one response is to stimulate consumption through easier debt. The second response is relying on external demand. And here there's something dangerous. A trade-off kicks in between the stimulation of exports and the stimulation of demand. i.e., in order to stimulate exports, policymakers more or less deliberately start repressing consumption, which means essentially repressing wages. Now, how stark, how worrisome this trade-off is will depend heavily on the price sensitivity of exports. How much exports depend on relative price differences. I will talk more about that. There is another possibility, which is what we call the balanced growth model, in which countries rely on two drivers, both consumption and exports. The two the drivers can operate simultaneously, but more likely they alternate. So exports pull the economy out of a recession, but then the economy stimulates the economy's growth mostly through the stimulation of consumption. This is not an export-led growth model. It could be heavily export-oriented, but the idea that you have to rely on net exports in order to grow is absent. In this model, you can export a lot, but the goal is to finance a growing large share of imports. In a nutshell, the consumption-led economy is epitomized by the UK, the export-led economy is epitomized by Germany, the balanced growth model is epitomized by Sweden, and then there is the possibility that with the crisis of wage-led growth, you find no alternative driver, which means stagnation. And that would be a case of neither consumption nor export-led growth model. That would be the Italian case. Let me quickly go through some statistics now to back up the claim that countries are fundamentally different in the way they grow. Here you have Germany and the UK, and these are the growth contributions of exports, the blue bar, and domestic demand, the red bar. Domestic demand is consumption, investment, and government, but the most important component is consumption, and the green bar is total growth. These figures are import corrected, and if you are curious what that means, I will be happy to address that issue in the questions and answers. But if you look at Germany between 1994 and 2015, the latest data available, Germany is clearly an economy in which growth is primarily pulled by exports, by a large margin. Incidentally, and contrary to what you hear in the press, according to these estimates, there has been no rebalancing after the crisis in Germany. Germany continues to be export-led. The UK is the specular opposite case. First of all, it grows faster until the crisis than Germany, but growth is almost entirely driven by domestic demand. Sweden has both. Sometimes it's exports, sometimes it's domestic demand. And after the crisis, especially between 2009 and 2013, it's primarily exports. And Italy essentially has no growth. To the extent that there is some growth, it is mostly domestic demand driven. Then I have also figures for Spain and France in case you're interested. Let me just say that Spain looks much more similar to the UK than it looks to Germany, and same thing for France. Although France, like other Mediterranean countries after the crisis, is being forced towards export-led. Let me talk about some stylized features of these growth models. First of all, let's talk about the UK. The consumption-led growth model tends to live beyond its means, as they say. The consumption means that savings are insufficient, and so they have to borrow from abroad. So this is a model which is characterized by endemic current account deficits. And those deficits need to be financed at some point, or they need to be eliminated, with one proviso that I'll talk about. In a country like the UK, or in the US, countries that have so-called exorbitant privilege, there is no need to worry about the current account deficit much. The rest of the world is willing to lend to you. Why? Because you have a very large, very liquid financial center, which is able to provide financial assets that the rest of the world wants to hold in its portfolio. Another feature of the consumption-led growth model is the growth of household debt. As we will see, at least until the crisis and before the turn to austerity in the UK, this was also a growth model characterized by fairly high real wage growth, especially in the service sector. Why? Because if consumption pulls, labor market conditions in the service sector, including the low-skilled service sector, are favorable to labor, which leads to high real wage growth. The German case, as I said, is the specular opposite. So first of all, for exports to be the driver of the economy as a whole, the export sector has to be large enough. If it's not large enough, it will not be able to counterbalance the recessionary effect of wage moderation on the domestic economy. It is characterized by endemic current account surpluses, And the most worrisome part, by an apparent trade-off between consumption and exports, which is due to the price sensitivity of exports. Let me go back to the graphs here. So if you look at Germany, you will see, and it's easier with figures that are not import corrected. You will see that as the contribution of exports increases during the mid-90s up to the crisis, the contribution of domestic demand goes down. It's not very clear here. It will be clear in another graph that I unfortunately forgot to bring with me. And the other thing is that, so if there is this trade-off, if in order to stimulate exports, one needs to keep wage growth in check, there is a price to pay for the export-led growth model, except that the price is unequally distributed. Not everybody pays the same price. The price, as I think this room knows well, is essentially or primarily paid by service sector workers and atypical workers. More briefly, for Sweden, the key difference between Sweden and Germany is not the importance of the export sector. The export sector is as important in Sweden as it is in Germany, but there is no necessary trade-off or apparent trade-off between export growth and consumption growth. Why is that the case? The argument we make is that Sweden, unlike Germany, moves out of manufacturing, moves into market sectors which are less price sensitive. And these are first ICT and then high value added services, business services in particular. So this allows this growth model to keep the consumption driver. And when the consumption driver kicks in, then you have also a favorable impact on real wages. We will see the real wages in Sweden have grown much faster than in Germany. The neither consumption nor export-led growth model, the Italian case, is characterized by the fact that all potential drivers of growth, real wage, household debt, exports, are not sufficiently big to act as locomotives. So there is very low real wage growth. There is an insufficient expansion of debt, also due to the constant need to do fiscal corrections because of the very large public debt which the country inherits from the 80s. And the export sector is now pulling the economy. It's just too small to be a real driver. Exports are price sensitive more than in Germany, and also the real exchange rate is heavily uncompetitive due to membership of the country in the euro, which means a highly uncompetitive real exchange rate for the country. Now, as I said, if a country has to be export-led, then the export sector has to be large enough. And this is the share of exports as percentage of GDP in the four countries. I would like to direct your attention to the German case, the blue line. Germany is in the same ballpark with Italy and the UK, but then from soon after the unification, the share of exports in Germany grows much faster than in other countries. And now Germany is comparable to Sweden, which is a large open economy. The other thing that I said is that the price sensitivity of exports is important because it determines whether there is a trade-off between the stimulation of consumption and the stimulation of exports. These are very simple regressions in which the growth of exports is regressed on the real exchange rates. This is a measure of the price sensitivity of exports and the growth of demand, world growth. plus a constant, which is 2009, which is a particular year in which trade falls everywhere. Focus on the coefficient of the real exchange rate, the measure of price competitive, which is negative and significant in Germany and Italy, insignificantly different from zero in Sweden and the UK. What does that negative coefficient mean? It means that if German unit labor costs increase by 1% relative to the unit labor costs of trade partners, German exports decrease by almost 1%, 0.8%. And you don't find that effect in Sweden. This is something more detailed. This is just the machinery and transportation equipment sector in Germany. This accounts for 50% of German exports. This is the auto industry, plus other industries. And these are moving window regressions. It's the same regression as before, except that now it is estimated on 11-year periods, moving 1 year at a time. And the real exchange rate is measured in two different ways. The one take home from this graph is that if in the 70s up to the early 80s, German exports were not price sensitive, the coefficient is insignificantly different from zero. It's the red ball up there. So Wolfgang Streeck and others in the industrial relations community that said German manufacturing competes on quality, not on cost, were absolutely right at that point in time. Over time, the coefficient becomes more and more negative. And the latest estimate, which is for the 11-year period between 1994 and 2013, the coefficient is not only negative, but highly negative and highly significant. So things have changed in Germany. Now let's move to the drivers of consumption-led growth. There are two possible channels here. One is real wage growth, and real wage growth, of course, depends on productivity, how fast productivity increases. As I said, real wage growth tends to be mostly endogenously determined by demand, but the other determinant is the growth of household debt, which has a mutual relationship with housing prices. If housing prices go up, household debt goes up, and vice versa. So these are statistics of debt of households as percentage of net disposable income, and you see a very clear difference between the two countries that have a consumption driver, which are the UK and Sweden, and the others. In Germany, household debt declines, whereas it increases pretty dramatically in Sweden. And in Italy, household debt does increase, but starting from very low levels, and clearly it doesn't increase enough to revitalize growth. Let's now move to real wage growth. These are real hourly wages deflated with the consumer price index in Germany and Italy to begin with. And these lines represent different sectors. So you have the manufacturing sector, accommodation and food, construction, finance and insurance, the total economy, and then the red solid line, it is labor productivity. First of all, look at the scales. So the German scale goes from 90 to 130, the Italian scale from 90 to 120. The German graph shows that all sectors stay below productivity increases, including manufacturing. But manufacturing is the clear wage leader. It is the sector where real wages increase the most. Look at what happens in the low-skilled sectors, like construction and accommodation. Wages remain flat until the crisis, and only then start increases. So this is what wage data look like in an export-led economy in which there is a trade-off between exports and consumption. Wages stay below productivity increases everywhere except in the key sector. That's the key sector. You have to hold on to the loyalty of core personnel in manufacturing. The low-skilled sectors have stagnant wages, and the gap grows over time. The Italian case is interesting because wages don't grow much, but they grow faster than productivity. Productivity is essentially stagnant in the Italian case. Let's look at the Swedish case. First of all, look at the scale. Now the scale is 100 to 180. Much greater real wage growth in Sweden than in Germany. And also, you don't see that kind of spread that you see in the German case. So the wage leader is finance. Manufacturing is just behind finance, but the low-skilled sectors grow almost in line with manufacturing. And then the one thing that I want to emphasize about the UK is that, again, you have very high, the scale is 100 to 200, very high real wages, but mostly in finance up to the crisis. And then a general wage stagnation after the crisis and a turn to austerity. Were things always the way I've showed them in Germany? Well, this is manufacturing versus services wage growth in Germany between 1974 and 1990. So you have labor productivity, high-end manufacturing, low-end services. This is retail and food and accommodation. And you see that wages in the high productivity manufacturing and the low productivity services grow in line with each other and in line with labor productivity. This is what you would expect from a collective bargaining system which is coordinated, in which the productivity increases that the high productivity sector generates are redistributed across the economy, stimulating consumption. But unfortunately, collective bargaining in Germany no longer works that way. So 1991, 2007, high-end manufacturing has real wages that grow almost in line with national productivity until 2005. Then there is a gap even there. But low-end services are completely stagnant. This is what I was talking about. This is like the unequal price being paid for stimulating exports. I want to say, 5 minutes. I want to say just a few words, but only a few words, about this distinction between dominant and dependent growth models. If you look at the periphery of Europe, say the South or the East, you will see variants of these export-led versus consumption-led growth model, except that rather than being dominant, they are peripheral. What does this notion mean? As I said, it's nice to be a consumption-led economy. You can actually consume more than you save, and the rest of the world finances your consumption, except that not everyone can do it. Actually, very few actors in the world economy can do it. Why can they do it? Because they are able to dictate the terms in financial markets. See, if I am a German firm and I export to Spain, most likely I want to be paid on my bank account in Germany. But if I am a German firm and I export to the UK, most likely I will have a bank account. This is the simplest trade plus capital account transaction. Most likely I will have a bank account in London, which means that the current account transaction, the export, generates a corresponding and compensating capital account transaction. So I am importing, but at the same time, I'm importing capital because that money goes on a bank account in London, in the city of London. The same does not happen with peripheral countries. Peripheral countries have an important and tighter current account constraint. So if they accumulate current account deficits year after year, which is what happened to the Mediterranean countries, at some point, the market, financial market, will say, you're accumulating too much external debt. Shrink the economy. And the same applies to export-led. Some Eastern European countries rely heavily on export-led growth, except that rather than being at the top of the global supply chains, they enter the global supply chains as in the middle, which means that they are in markets characterized by low value added and low opportunities for upgrading. The politics of growth models. So who decides whether a country should have this type of growth model? Well, our working assumption, we're working on producing the data that would back this up, is that this is not a matter for democratic accountability. It's not the case that there is a majority of the electorate in Germany that votes for export-led, and a majority of the electorate in the UK that votes for consumption-led, and a majority of the electorate in Italy that votes for stagnation. That's not the case. It's a matter of elites. Behind growth models, there are social blocks, and these social blocks are a combination of class, sector, and ideology. Very briefly, a social bloc rotates around a key sector. The key sector in Germany is export-oriented manufacturing. Within the key sectors, there are cross-class coalitions. Capital and labor sharing some fundamental interests, except being asymmetrically placed in the core of the growth model. And then there is a compatible periphery and an incompatible periphery. The compatible periphery is a periphery whose interests can be accommodated without fundamentally disrupting the key requirements of the growth model. And the incompatible periphery is a periphery that, if you take their interests into account, the growth model falls apart. And these will be the low-skilled workers in Germany. What's the role of party politics? So democracy matters, but it matters as a constraint. So democracy dictates the limits that elite can reach to accommodate the requirements of the growth model. So we share with the party cartelization literature the idea that if a growth model is clearly in place on these fundamental issues of macroeconomic policy, there will not be great partisan disparity. The key mainstream parties will essentially share the same recipe for how the economy works and what the economy needs to continue to work. Partisan competition becomes more important when the growth model is up for grabs, when it's not clear when it's pulled by one sector as opposed to another. What parties do, in the best of circumstances, a growth model will not have a numerical majority. Take the export sector in Germany, in the best possible, according to the most optimistic calculations, it will directly affect 35% of the electorate. You need to get to 50%. How do you get to 50%? Through traditional redistributive politics, to the extent that you can do it. And here there are some fundamental constraints in the German case due to the trade-off between consumption and exports, but also there is an hegemonic component. You try to persuade somebody, ideally a portion which is large enough to bring you to 50% plus one, that that's the way the economy works. That, the interest of the core social bloc are the interest of the country as a whole. And let me conclude with some words about the future. Now, all these post-wage-led growth models are fundamentally unstable. Consumption-led is associated with asset price bubbles, which at some point explode, and we see what happens. We've seen what happens with the crisis. Export-led is simply not tenable as a generalized strategy. If everybody wants to be export-led, nobody can be export-led. So they are fundamentally unstable. Second, there is the environmental constraint behind all of these growth models. I mean, growth means consuming limited, scarce environmental resources. I would say this is a problem for the long run. In the short run, the environmental constraint is actually a stimulant. I mean, the need for alternative energy and for green investment may actually be an opportunity to relaunch investments in all of these countries and rebalance the model. There are threats coming from the Eurozone. Once upon a time, until 2009 to be precise, the Eurozone allowed for two growth models. Consumption-led in the periphery, especially in Spain, but also in Ireland, also in Greece, and then export-led in the core. And consumption-led was allowed because although there weren't clear institutional mechanisms to relax the current account constraint that I talked about, there were implicit mechanisms. Financial markets thought that, yes, Spain has 10% current account deficit, but clearly it's in a common currency, and there is this idea of joint liability. So the euro as a whole is liable for the external debt of these countries. That illusion clearly withered away with the sovereign debt crisis, and now there is only one growth model which is allowed in Europe, and that's the export-led growth model. And if you look at the statistics for these countries, they're all turning into export-led, except Spain. Except that the export sector is too small, and so slow growth is very slow. And finally, the politics and the economics of growth model are not tightly coupled. There is no architect of the growth model which decides what happens in the economy and what happens in politics. There is a core growth model which is trying to maintain its viability, a core social bloc which is trying to maintain its viability, but sometimes they make mistakes. Brexit could be one of those mistakes. Brexit may be a political decision that was taken against the interest of the core actors in the consumption-led growth model, which is mortgage finance and the construction industry. So there is loose coupling between economics and policy, and the excluded periphery in a formally democratic regime still votes just like everyone else. And when they vote, they can capsize the boat. And that's all on my side.